press the space key, and we have looked at setting up core servers and setting up domain controllers and Active Directory on core servers and joining workstations and creating management workstations for core servers. It's all been about the core. In this video, we're going to install some 2019 servers, this time instead of core with desktop experience. Now, I don't recommend it because generally for your servers and domain controllers, you want a smaller attack surface. You want core. That's one reason, the smaller attack surface. Another reason or advantage for core is that it consumes less resources, right? If your server doesn't have to provide a rich graphical interface and play multimedia and things like that and take care of, rendering images and so forth, then it can use more of its resources, its I/O and its memory and its CPU cycles for what it's intended for serving out, for services and tasks and things. And so the idea behind the whole core and management workstation setup is that your servers serve, they don't have to worry about the GUI, and you manage those core servers. They themselves don't have a GUI, don't implement a GUI, but you manage those core servers from a management workstation that does have a GUI, okay? But there is another option, and that is you can install in this case a server with the desktop experience, in which case it'll basically combine those. So yes, it does give you a larger attack surface, it does consume more resources, but if we want to, we can, and that's what this video is about, if that's an option that you choose. So I'm going to choose install now, just going with the defaults. And in this case, if I want a GUI, right, I want to choose desktop experience and not core. Notice core is the default, because core is better, if you ask me, in my opinion. But we'll go with the desktop experience. Next. And accept the license terms, and next. And I'm going to do, it's not an upgrade, I'm going to do custom. And you could do partitioning if you wanted to, and create different partitions and so forth. I'm going to keep it simple. Go with the default and just allocate all of that drive space for my operating system. And if I wanted to add storage later, I could. But there's options. If you wanted to, you could configure something there. Now it's going to go through the Windows Desktop Experience server setup for 2019. And ultimately, we'll also look at setting up Active Directory the GUI way. We set up Active Directory on our core servers, which is my preferred way, because of the advantages you get from running core server and then just managing core servers remotely via a management workstation. But because I know some of you may want to do it the other way, you might want to set it up with the GUI built in with desktop experience, we'll look at how to set up Active Directory that way as well. And now I need to customize the settings. So we're going to set the administrator password and click finish. And now we can sign in to our first 2019 server. Okay. And I'm going to say yes. And no, don't show this message again. We will get Windows Admin Center, but we're going to put that in a management workstation, not on a server. This is going to be in a domain controller. So this is our first installation of 2019. Now I need to set up a second 2019 server. So I'm going to sign in to my Windows 2019 server with desktop experience installed. And I have a server manager, and it always pops up by default. But what I want to do first is some preliminary things before I set up a domain controller. So I'm going to change my network settings, and like we did when we set up Active Directory on our core servers, I want to configure at least a DNS server change, and I want to set up a static IP, right? I mean, I'm using DHCP right now. Okay, so see, DHCP is enabled, so I'm using DHCP. But you always want to give your domain controllers a static IP, okay? So in this case, I'm going to give these guys, or this first one, a static IP, and 192.168.70, and I'm going to go with 5. And the default gateway, actually, let me go with, I'm going to start up a little bit higher here. I just want to make sure I have room to add in other servers for other things. All right, so 192.168.70.25, a Class C subnet mask. My gateway router, which is 192.168 and 70 and 2. Okay, and my preferred DNS server, my primary DNS server would normally be, for external name resolution would be 192.168.72. Look, see here. But in this instance, I want to point this server to itself first. 192.168.70.25. Okay, I want to basically point this server to itself. It's going to become a domain controller, and when it goes through the Active Directory creation process of creating ntds.dit, the Active Directory database, and configuring the sysfile folder for replication, it's going to need to be able to find and create all of these objects in the global catalog. It's going to be the first global catalog server, the first forest, the first domain, all of that on one server, all 5 operations master roles on that one server. So it's very important that it literally be able to find itself. That sounds so metaphysical. But so anyway, as a preliminary step, I'm going to do this now. I'm not going to worry about a secondary or tertiary right now, and I'm not going to worry about external name resolution, because when we get done, we're going to configure this to set up ADI, or Active Directory Integrated DNS, and we'll just go set up DNS Forwarding to have it resolve hostname queries outside our local domain onto the internet. Okay, so for now, I'll click OK, OK, close, 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 and I just want to check those settings. Okay, DHCP enabled, so now no. All right, so good. Here's my static IP, and I'm going to make sure I'm using the server itself for DNS. Okay. I would never recommend changing a hostname once you set a machine up as a domain controller. So in this example, right, in this case, I could either get to it through Server Manager or Control Panel. Either way of it. I changed my computer name as well. What sort of a theme are we going to go with here? All right, Galactica. All right. Why not? Okay. And of course our other one will have to be the Pegasus, right? If you're a BSG fan. And let me just change my description to there. So it's Galactica. And we're going to reboot, and then we're going to go through the setup process for Active Directory. Okay, so we've given ourselves a static IP. And we've given ourselves a static IP, right? HTTP is disabled. Here's our static IP. We have configured our server to use itself as a DNS server, and we've modified our host name. All right, I never, just because of all the SRV records and things that get created that have host name information, I do not recommend ever changing the host name of a server once it becomes a domain controller. So you want to come up with your scheme for naming things before you set up Active Directory and before you promote your servers to domain controllers. And once you give them a host name, they should remain that host name for the duration of the period that they act as a domain controller. Okay. So we have all the preliminaries set now. Static IP, DNS configured, hostname is what we want. Now we want to go through the first part of the setup process. So we're going to go to Add Roles and Features under Manage and Server Manager. And I'm just going to do Next. I want to select the server itself. Next. And what I want to add is Active Directory domains and services. And I also want to make sure this option is checked, include the management tools. Okay, we'll need all those nice management tools to manage Active Directory once it is installed. And we did that from from a PowerShell prompt. We did it on the core servers. So now we're doing it graphically with the GUI. With our 2019 desktop experience server. So I'm going to click on Install now. Have everything selected. And Active Directory Domain Services will then be set up on our 2019 server. And notice the message here, configuration required. Installation succeeded on Galactica. So we're done with the directory services feature installation process, but we're not done with configuring and setting up a domain controller. And once directory services are installed, if I click over here in Server Manager, notice I now have this option, promote this server to a domain controller. So in the core setup videos that we did previously, we did this in PowerShell. But now we can do it graphically through desktop experience. I just click on this link. And notice that I have these options, right? Add a domain controller to an existing domain. Not appropriate because we haven't set up Active Directory yet. There is no forest. There is no domain. Nothing to add to. The second option, also add a new domain to an existing forest, is not appropriate because we haven't set up a forest yet. So what we need to select is the third option. We're configuring an entire new forest and domain. And the root domain name, since my server's name is Galactica, I could go with something like Colonial Fleet or Battle Stars or something. Let's say battlestars.fleet. I don't know. Okay. So that'll be our domain name. And we'll stay with the first functional level here. Just be careful with this in terms of if you have certain servers, certain services, certain things that you might require a lower functional level. If you go lower, you can always raise the functional level higher. But if you go higher, you can't go backwards. You understand what I'm saying? You can't bring the functional level down, because by that time, changes have already been made to the schema, and you couldn't do that. You wouldn't want to do that. So if for any reason you have older servers, older things on your network that you need to maintain Active Directory compatibility for, you might choose a lower functional level. But in this case, we're going to go with the highest functional level, because we don't have anything yet in this environment. This is all from scratch. So, yes, I want to configure a domain name server and a global catalog, because we don't have one yet. Here's the password, the directory services restore mode password. That's if you have to do an authoritative restore in AD. Remember how Active Directory replicates information in a multi-master model? So things, changes get made on different domain controllers, and they get replicated around. Well, if one administrator makes a change on one domain controller and another administrator makes a change on another domain controller, how do they know which changes were recent? How do they know which change should win if there's a conflict, a replication conflict? And the way that works is the Active Directory replication process affixes a timestamp. In addition to that timestamp, it affixes a serial number to the number of changes that have been made on that object. So as it gets replicated around from domain controller to domain controller, if there is a conflict and the timestamp is the same, it looks at the serial number, and the one with the greatest serial number that has been incremented the most, that's the one that is given dominance. That's the one that overwrites the other conflicting information. Well, an authoritative restore is the opposite of that. Basically, you're restoring old Active Directory information, to the Active Directory database from a backup, an old backup, and you're forcibly overwriting newer information for reasons, say Active Directory had become corrupt, or there was corrupt data being replicated in AD. That's a situation where you do an authoritative restore, and that basically reverses the conflict resolution process with replication. So that's what this password is for, that process whereby you would then forcibly overwrite AD information. So an important password, you want to write it down somewhere, keep it handy. Make sure you remember that password. And specify DNS delegation options, create DNS. I'm going to go with the defaults here. Next. And alright, so it's going to be battle stars minus the .fleet. I'm fine with that. I'm going to go next. Okay, we're going to keep with the default settings here, the NTDS, the Active Directory database and the sysfile folder. But you might choose to put these on separate storage, separate drives. Well, this is your opportunity to do that. We looked at ways to specify that in PowerShell, but this is a way you can specify the different locations graphically if you wanted to. I'm going to stick with the defaults. Okay, here's just a summary of our choices, what's going to happen, and then I'm going to click Next. Okay, and these warnings here, basically you're going to get that. We can ignore these warnings here. I guess I'll go over them. Windows Server to make sure have a default for the security setting name allow cryptography that prevents weaker cryptography efforts from establishing security channel sessions. Yeah, we can ignore that. Delegation for this DNS server cannot be created because the authoritative parent zone cannot be found. Well, it doesn't exist yet. Active Directory doesn't exist yet. So that's okay. The important thing is the prerequisites are set up and they are configured. Alright, so we have static IP, DNS server settings, we have Active Directory domain services, all that good stuff. We have configured things the way they need to be configured for our first domain controller and our first forest and our first domain. And now we're going to click on install. Okay, and we've completed the reboot process. Now notice that because it's a domain controller, there's no longer a local logon for this 2019 server. So when you promote a 2019 server to a domain controller, you cannot log onto it locally anymore. You can only log into AD. Okay? So the domain Battlestars administrator, that account for my convenience so I can get into AD was moved into Active Directory. Okay. And I'm going to just close Server Manager for a moment. We're going to take a look at a few changes. So alright. So notice our primary DNS suffix is now battlestars.fleet. So we have a fully qualified domain name in our domain, an FQDN for all of our servers. And in this case, this would be galactica.battlestars.fleet. So, well, let me just see, here's my host name, right? Galactica. And look, here's the domain, Battlestars, and I'm signed in as administrator. So, I can ping Galactica. There's my IP version 6 addressing, but notice that it returns galactica.battlestars.fleet. That's the fully qualified domain name, in this case of my server. Alright. And let's look at a few tools here. Just going to go to this file location and we'll throw some shortcuts on the desktop. And also there. Okay. All right. So under administrative tools, notice we have all these tools. And of chief importance would be ADAC, Active Directory Administration Center, and ADUC, Active Directory Users and Computers. Active Directory Domains and Trust and Sites and Services would also be very useful. I'm going to grab DNS as well. Okay. And I'll just like to give these guys a short name. Okay. So now if we take a look, we can open ADUC and now we see our domain, right? Here's our Active Directory. It's been created. All right, so the database is there. And I might make a domain admin. I'm just going to make an organizational unit. Which is a folder. I'm just going to call it admins. Actually, yeah, domain admins, there we go. This will be a separate folder, and we're going to create a couple of users here. And we'll go with, let's see. That's too long. We'll just say Adama. All right, Commander Adama. And let's do. All right, so there's Adama, and I'm just gonna copy and same type of user. Actually, before I do that, let me make this user a member of domain admins. Admin ease. Boy, I'm telling you. Time to get my prescription changed. Okay. Alright, and then I'm just gonna copy this account and we'll do Starbuck. We'll make her a domain admin. Okay, and notice because I copied her, she's also a member of domain admins. And let's see, who else will we add? Saul. And Saul's also an admin. All right. So I have some local administrators set up. We have Active Directory set up. Now, the next thing I want to do is check some things out with DNS. So I'm going to open up the DNS tool and notice, okay, here it created our delegation, right, our zone. And here we have our A records, so they're mapping our hostname to IP. Here we can create pointer records for reverse lookup to map an IP to a hostname. And very important, all of these SRV service records were created to say, hey, this is a global catalog server, the first one of its kind, right? It's just been created. What I want to do now is set up DNS forwarding. Before we do that, I want you to take a look at something. Here's my IP settings, right? So I'm still on static IP, and here's my router, but notice what the Active Directory setup process did. I had configured the static IP as 192.168.70.2.5, and look what the setup process did. It changed it to the loopback. It's still the same, right? I mean, it's still 192.168.70.2.5, but now we have this as a loopback, okay? And that's fine. I don't have a secondary or a tertiary DNS server yet because I don't have, this is the first domain controller. No others have been set up yet. Ultimately, when I get additional domain controllers configured and additional DNS servers, I want to add a secondary and tertiary DNS and point. I basically can point them to each other for secondary and tertiary DNS server settings. And that way, if anything goes wrong with DNS on one, then it can still perform name resolution through secondary or tertiary DNS server settings. But I wanted you to see that it modified that. It still points to itself as a primary DNS server. Okay, and again, if we see how that looks in network settings, let me go to adapter settings, double click properties, IP version 4. Okay, so you can see this is what the Active Directory setup process changed. Okay, I configured the static IP of my host. Same thing, it's a loopback, but preferentially, you want your domain controller to use itself for name resolution. But if it's going to do that, how are you going to resolve external, name queries, DNS hostname queries? Well, the way to do that, you set up DNS forwarding. So right-click Properties, go to Forwarders, and I want to set up, in this case, my external DNS is 192.168.70.2. Okay? And I'm also going to set up Google just to speed things up a bit, because I don't have anything, specifically set for those external queries. All right, so these two addresses, this is my router gateway / external DNS, and this is just Google's DNS, right? So they're set up as forwarders. So now any of my clients that use the domain controllers and the Active Directory integrated DNS internally can now pass name queries externally to the internet with those settings. We haven't set up DHCP yet, but once we did, we would configure all that information in the DHCP scopes so that clients would then get the internal DNS, and then through the internal DNS, they'd be able to resolve name queries outside. And let's just test that theory, right? If we will. So if I ping the Galactica, that's IP version 6, but notice here's the fully qualified domain name, or FQDN, of my host, right? Again, there's my host, but look, I'm signed into the domain, and if I ping it, I get an FQDN, a fully qualified domain name. And let me just do this. All right. So if I ping IP version 4, you can see that that's my static IP. Okay. And then there's my FQDN. However, if I'm only configured to use the loopback, how the heck could I do name resolution? Let's see if we can go out there and reach out and touch Yahoo. Oh, what do you know? There's Yahoo. Why? Because we set up DNS forwarding. And the same would be true for all of our other clients. So again, we go to DNS, right-click the zone, properties, the DNS server, go to forwarders, and that's where we would set up either external DNS servers or the IP addresses of other servers that can forward our name resolution queries outside our domain. In this case, to the internet. Okay? All right. With that being done and said, let us go and set up the second domain controller in our new Active Directory domain, but this time instead of core, using our 2019 desktop experience graphical user interface version. So now I want to assign it to my second 2019 desktop experience server, right? It's not a domain controller, so I only have, and it's not a member server either. So there's no Active Directory login for me yet. I haven't joined it to the domain, and I haven't promoted it to a domain controller. So my only option is to sign in locally. Okay. And server manager pops up, but we don't need that just yet. First things, first we want to take care of the preliminaries. So I'm going to open a command prompt as administrator just in case I need or decide to do something with administrator privileges, and I'm going to open control panel. All right. So notice if I look at my IP settings, notice that DHCP is enabled. And notice my DNS server, right? So this is not my domain controller. This is not my Active Directory integrated DNS server here. So this needs to change. And also, before I promote this to a domain controller, it needs a static IP. We'd never want a domain controller to have an address that was dynamically assigned via DHCP. So all these things need to be changed. All right. So to do that, in Control Panel, I'll go to Network and Sharing Center, change adapter settings, double click on my Ethernet adapter properties, double click on IP version 4. Here are the settings I need to change. So use the following IP address for version 4, 192.168.70, and my first domain controller was 25, so this will make this one 26. A Class C subnet mask, subnetting on 3 octets, that's fine. My router address, 192.168.70.2 for our default gateway. And preferred DNS server. Remember on the first domain controller we configured the domain controller to use itself? Now what I want to do is only point this at that first domain controller. So this is just until we complete the setup process, and then we can go in and add a secondary and tertiary. But for now, just 192.168.70 and 25. I want it to point to the IP address of only of the Active Directory Integrated DNS Server, which is the first domain controller we set up. Okay, so I click OK, and OK, and close, and close, and close. Now, if I get my IP information, look, the DHCP is disabled, right? Because enabled no. We have a static IP now. There's our IP version 4 address. Class C subnet good. There's our router, default gateway, and now look at our only DNS server. It's 192.168.70.25. So that would resolve Galactica, right? So if I ping galactica.battlestars.fleet, there's the IP version 4 address. I can replace. And there's no way for me to go out, right? My only IP points to that internal DNS server, but because we set up DNS forwarding, watch. All right, so we can forward name queries that are external to the internet through DNS forwarding on that server. And if I look at my name resolution cache, all right, so display DNS. See? It's the only real DNS server that I'm querying at this point. Okay, so we've taken care of that preliminary step. Next thing I want to do is I'm going to change the name of the server. Remember, you want to do that before you promote it to a domain controller, because you do not want to change the host name after you promote a server to a domain controller. So we'll do that, and we could open Control Panel and go to System, or we can open Server Manager and go here. Either way you want to do that. I'm going to click Change. Since the first domain controller was Galactica, we'll call this one Pegasus, okay? And the domain is specifically battlestars.fleet, but we can just get away with Battlestars here. And this needs to be the name of an Active Directory account that has permission to join member servers, workstations, computers to the domain. So remember, we created a Dama, Starbuck, Saul, in this case Starbuck, okay, and now it says welcome to the Battlestars domain, okay, and it will ask us to reboot, and I'm just gonna, let's see, what did I call that? Pegasus. I'm gonna change the computer description here to match, and I'm gonna reboot to complete the process of joining Active Directory, joining 2019 Desktop Experience Server now will become a member server, not a domain controller yet, but once we reboot, a member server, part of Active Directory. Okay, now that we're a member server, actually a part of AD, watch this. If I click on other users, now I have the option to sign into the domain, right? So now Starbuck wanted to, since she's a member of Active Directory and a domain admin, she could sign in on our 2019 Desktop Experience member server. It's now a member of Active Directory. It's joined to Active Directory. Okay. So she signs in. And what I want to do, now that she's signed in this case, we want to do the same thing. We want to add directory services, domain services. So I'm going to, inside Server Manager, I'm going to click Manage, Add Rules and Features. And I'm just going to go Next, Next, select the server itself, Pegasus. And in this case, we want to select Active Directory Domain Services. And I'm going to select Add Features and make sure, include management tools. We'll need those. Going to go with Add Features. Going to click Next, Next, and Next. And then finally install. Okay. Installation succeeded. I'm going to click Close if I want to. And again, if I click up here, look at this option now. So I have Promote this server to a domain controller. I'm going to select that option. And now my choice is different. The first time we did add a new forest, right? Because none existed, nor did a domain exist. Now I'm choosing the first option, add a domain controller to an existing domain, because it already exists. And because I joined the domain as a member server first, I have DNS suffix information and domain information already. So therefore I can just go with the defaults here, battlestars.fleet. Next. I'm going to make this a global catalog too. And I also want Active Directory integrated DNS. Set up my directory services restore password for an authoritative restore. Oops. Okay, confirm. Next. I'm going to go with the default. Next. And replicate from any domain controller. Well, there's only one, right? That's the first domain controller we set up. 192.168.70.25, which is the Galactica. And next, I'm going to go with all the defaults for the ntds.dit Active Directory database and sysfile replication folders. And here's all my options that have been selected. Next. We get a bunch of warnings, but the important thing is, did we pass the prerequisite check? Yes, we did. So we have the prereqs, the prerequisites. I'm going to click on install. And we can ignore, those are just pretty much the default warnings you get when you set up AD or add a domain controller, but notice it's replicating. It'll tell you up here all the things it's copying over and replicating and creating and configuring. Okay, and I'm about to be signed out, and we'll reboot. And again, if we sign in, Notice we no longer have a local logon. We can only sign into the domain because now it's not just a member server, now it's a domain controller. We lost that local sign-on. There's only an active directory sign-in process. And then if we sign in again, let's go grab a few tools. And alright, so let's open up ADUC. If we do, here's our domain, right? Our users, our domain admins, all of that stuff is there. And for DNS, we have replicated zone information. There's A records for Pegasus and Galactica, SRV service records, there's a global catalog. And same thing, I want to set up forwarding. Okay, so here's our forwarding addresses. We can do external name resolution now. And the last thing I might want to do is add, secondary, I could do tertiary and so forth, but to do that, my DNS a bit of fault tolerance. Okay, and so in this case, the setup process, it just configured itself the local loopback. So primary DNS and secondary DNS, that's fine. We could also configure it 26, but the domain controller setup process actually changed it just to the loopback address 127.0.0.1. That gives us a bit of fault tolerance. DNS wise. Also, I want you to see something. If I go to Active Directory users and computers, and I look under domain controllers, right? So now you can see Galactica and Pegasus. There's our two domain controllers, and they're both, host the global catalog. I want to go to Network and Sharing Center, change adapter settings, Ethernet properties, and I'm just going to configure 192.168, my number lock on, 192.168.70 and 26 as a secondary DNS server. And so now Pegasus will be my secondary DNS server on my first domain controller. And in this case, both domain controllers have an alternate DNS server to use or to query in case one's down.